Everybody, welcome. Good to see a good number of people on the session as well. So this session is about workplace education and COVID. And as Jacob said, we've got two speakers. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Tracy Wade. I'm the chair of the Atlantic Planners Institute. I'm out of Sackville, New Brunswick. I've been a professional planner for let's say 20 years approximately, and I've worked in the private public sector at the provincial level, regional level, and municipal level as well. So, but right now I'm here as the chair of the Atlantic Planners Institute. So welcome you all from that perspective, and pleased to be a sponsor of the conference. So our two speakers today, first we've got Neil Lovett. He's a professional planner who leads the planning and economic intelligence divisions of Turner Drake and Partners, which is a real estate consultancy based in Halifax. Neil's work focuses on real estate market analysis, demographic and socioeconomic analysis and forecasting, and real estate finance and development economics. He and his team specialize in projects where the economics of the built environment intersect with the vision and goals of planning policy. So Neil is a graduate of Dalhousie's Bachelor of Community Design program and also holds diplomas in GIS and urban planning from Fanshawe College and urban land economics from the University of British Columbia. Our other speaker is Jacob Ritchie. He is the operations director for the Halifax Regional Center for Education. His teams are responsible for technology in schools, transportation to and from school throughout HRM, all maintenance, cleaning, and construction in schools, and long-range planning and capital planning for school investment. Jacob has worked in a wide variety of communities across North America, where he has had the opportunity to manage and deploy engineering and city building projects that have strengthened community and improved public spaces. His training and experience as engineer and planner help bridge the interprofessional gaps in the design community and inform risk-taking when facing complex challenges in cities today. So what we're going to do is we'll have both of our gentlemen speak for 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and as well there's a couple of questions that I've got myself in terms of the topic again, which is workplace education and COVID. Anybody want to go first? Yeah, Jacob's on my left, so we'll start with him.
All right, super. I've got a small amount of echo there. It seems to be gone. Great. I have a presentation. I'm going to share screen. Is that's okay with everyone? I think that works. Bear with me. So what you should see up on your screen right now is just a title page that says Education, Changing for a Pandemic. I've got about 9 slides. Should take me about 10 minutes to go through. I'm going to talk a bit about what our last year has been like here at the Halifax Regional Center for Education, and how we've moved through a very different school year, or 2 very different school years, really. So I'm going to introduce the Halifax Regional Center for Education and a bit of what we do in operations. I guess an intro of myself. Tracy, thanks for that. I don't have to do much after you did that intro. Our initial response back in March when things first happened about a year ago, our back to school plan, how we came back to school and the different ways we planned for that, what steady states look like for us throughout this year, and then really trying to think a bit about the new normal and where we're headed for education in the future based on the learnings from the pandemic, and then some takeaways. So HRC and operations, here we are a public education system providing English language and French immersion curriculum for grades pre-primary to 12. Pre-primary students have to be 4 before the end of their first school year. So we do have 3-year-olds in our education system, all the way up to grade 12, which some of us remember. We deliver education in line with the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development policies, as well as the Nova Scotia Education Act. And HRCE covers the same geography as the Halifax Regional Municipality. So we have 136 schools in 147 buildings. It's over 8 million square feet of institutional space. We have 53,000 students, 11,000 staff, and operation services, as was said in my intro, is capital planning and construction, maintenance, custodial, transportation, and IT. So back in March, we had our initial response. I have there a picture of our Quato 44 disinfectant that we use throughout the schools. One of the big questions that came up is, are schools safe? So we've had really since H1N1, we've had a pandemic, or sorry, not a pandemic, but an infectious disease response that we work with public health on whenever we have a certain percentage of our staff or students out sick. We have protocols and standard operating procedures that we have in our schools for how to clean that school differently, how to work with public health to make sure they get in there to test any infectious diseases that may be coming through. And that's something that we've had in place for a decade. But we've had a cleaning process for years that wasn't using disinfectants that kill viruses. We were using lighter disinfectants or lighter cleaners thought to be less harmful potentially to children and students if they interacted with them. So when COVID hit last March, the cleaners we were using throughout our schools didn't actually kill COVID or many other things. They were a surface cleaner, not a disinfectant. So other things we could do in response, we said, we're closed for 2 weeks. What happens when we come back? Can we gather? What do teachers have? And what do they know how to use? What do students have and what do they know how to use? Can our staff go to work? Who is the front line? So these are questions we asked ourselves last March. Truthfully, teachers and students didn't know how to work in shared online spaces last March. I think that's something that is really important to think about. It's really been a fascinating year to watch our professional teachers and our student body get up to speed on what it is to use shared learning. I'm sure all of those DAL students have gone through the same practice. Some profs and some students are excelling, others not so well. So that was a big question for us. And then as the operations department, we had to ask at what point in March could we go back to work? So our staff was off for 2 weeks last March, and then we got back to work, and we've been at work ever since. We never really, you can't be remote when you're the operations folks and the front line of making schools safe. So that was really March to July last year. This picture is always funny, thinking about still students working nicely at home. I have 3 kids at home, and when we were home remotely working and the children were on devices, it does not go smoothly. It is a very large challenge. And further to that, it actually is, it's incredibly stressful. And you can't really talk about education change without talking about the stress on families. Trying to get your kids to do the work while you're trying to work remotely it's just fascinating that we went through this, and really we still don't have answers in many cases. People with great privilege, like myself, you know, separate devices for all the kids, spaces for all of them to work, still a challenge, still, you know, and I can't imagine what people are going through who don't have the means to give those devices and those access to their children when they're working remotely. And we'll talk a bit about what the school board's doing to sort of close that gap as we go through the different stages of the pandemic. So we made a back to school plan. It had 3 scenarios. Scenario A was all students in school, layered measures in place. This was if our epidemiology supported it. So cohorting classes, keeping them together all day, doing additional cleaning, extending and increasing ventilation, masks for students, masks for staff, limitations on gatherings, limitations on visitors, changes to the way we laid out classrooms, and then education coming to the cohort rather than the cohort to the education. So an example of this would be students used to go to the music room all day. They'd shuffle in and out of there. Now the music teacher goes to the classroom. So it's just limiting the amount of people traveling throughout the school so that you don't get exposure between cohorts. We also, I've got on the screen sort of shared examples of how we got out to the system, looked at our standard classroom layout, and saw how we could distance the desks properly and how many children we could fit in each classroom with the distancing. Obviously, it wasn't always possible, but we did as much as we could, given the physical space constraints we had. We also had a scenario B, which we never had to enact, but it was elementary children to continue to go to school with layered measures in place, but the high school students go home and they work remotely. So we would then use the high schools to increase the distance between children in spaces and reduce the cohort size. So who goes where, how many rooms do we need? Be ready for that was another thing that was on my team last July, was creating a shadow bus system, shadow assignments of staffing to different spaces that they'd never been in before. And we had to create all of that and the potential that we needed it. What's interesting about this is we have over 3,800 classrooms in HRCE. So deciding who goes into each classroom in a hypothetical scenario was a really large challenge that we needed to be ready for in case the community needed us to do that if the epidemiology changed. We never went into scenario B. And then scenario C was remote learning for all. So this was back to where we were in March of 2020, but thinking with more preparation. So we bought a very large number of Chromebooks, technology. We were able to get it in the hands of students and staff, headsets for staff, webcams for staff and students where they didn't have them available through laptop devices. So a lot of purchasing, procurement, setup, distribution, and training on technology, trying to prepare to ensure that all teachers and students could participate in online learning. We weren't ready for that beforehand. We had about one Chromebook for every 2 kids in our system. And now we're still not at 1-to-1, but we're a lot closer. We're about 8,000 Chromebooks away. The biggest thing we needed to do to prepare for this was teacher training to make sure they were ready for it. So that gap between March and opening up in the next school year, making sure teachers were prepared to teach online, having the lessons plans ready, and converting what they may have been doing in the classroom for a decade to something that could work online that might have been a modification. So a lot of our teachers put in that extra effort in this school year to make that happen. Now we're in steady state. We still have our layered measures. We're working with labor and occupational health and safety to make sure the schools are safe for everyone, that we're meeting our standards. We're working with joint occupational health and safety committees in schools. We're continuing with updating the PPE, the protective equipment supplies, so cloth masks, gowns, face shields, hand sanitizer, whatever they need in schools, we're there to supply. And then when outbreaks occur, we respond. So when we have a case in a school, like we have had every couple of weeks since November, we respond with extra in-depth cleaning, a 3-day closure, a period of time where students are working remotely and staff are working remotely, and then we come back to the school after having done all the necessary testing in the school community to make sure that we can safely open our doors. And then going forward, we're looking at a new normal. So, with everything I've just described, what about this has been great? What has really worked for kids? What can we keep doing that we should keep doing? So that's something I'm happy to talk about as we get into the Q&A. But it's the cleaners. Do we keep using the disinfectants we're using, or are there long-term effects where we should stop that? How do we manage people in space? Should we continue to have those teachers move around the school or the students move around the school? And then how do we allow new visitors into our space? Do we let parent volunteers come back in? We think there's huge benefit to that, but there's the risk of those, the breakdown to our cohorting and our protection of the school community and the environment. And then finally, building new spaces. What should we change? We're building a couple new schools right now where we're looking at what should we do for hand washing stations, as well as washrooms, as well as the different ways we get drinking water that should be different in schools going forward. So that's a big part of what my team's trying to deliver going into 2021 and beyond. So the interesting thing that I thought about when I reflect on this year is, we are best at being ready for things we've experienced before. My team is really good at responding to hurricanes. We get things fixed. We get school open quickly. We know how to do that. We've experienced that here, and we call that emergency preparedness. And we have a business continuity management plan that focuses on a lot of disasters that kind of look and feel like hurricanes or big natural disasters. Our business continuity management plan hadn't thought about pandemics in the same way. We'll certainly be ready for the next pandemic in a way that we weren't this time, and it will still crush us, I'm sure. But we've gone through this now in a way that some other parts of the world had through H1N1. We only had minor experience with H1N1, but now through this, we think we'll be more prepared. But what it made me think about is, what are the other things that we're not prepared for right now that we can see coming or could see coming if we took more scenario development and thought about plausible futures that could be happening so we can be prepared. The fact that our teachers weren't ready for online learning in 2020 is something that probably we could have taken care of. The fact that I wasn't ready to maximize the use of high school spaces if students stayed home, I'd never even thought of that. So, if we do some of that work now on some other plausible scenarios that maybe aren't pandemics, we might be better prepared for the next thing we're responding to. So I had a question slide. I won't keep that up because we have that later, but I stopped sharing and I will pass over to Neil.
Great. Well,
I always have this nightmare that my mic was on mute the whole time.
Yeah, we're waiting for you to start, Jacob. All right, let me share my screen here. Is that coming up for everyone? Yeah, I'm great. Thanks. I'm actually super happy, Jacob, that you went first because I'm trying to look at sort of down the road a little bit. And I think everything you just went through about the experience of enduring COVID and adjusting to all of those unknowns really kind of feeds into what I'm hoping to talk quickly about. And yeah, when I was first approached or asked to do a quick talk on this topic, I didn't really think, oh yeah, that's easy enough. I can talk about, how pandemics affecting the workplace. Really, in my role, we focus a lot on commercial real estate, and so the big topic is always like, is office space dead? It's the future of the office. And as I actually got closer to preparing for this, it became a lot more difficult. And I wanted to not be so narrow in talking because obviously offices are only one type of workplace that only affects certain industries. So I started looking a bit broader and trying to wrap my head around things. And basically came to this conclusion. Um, who the heck knows what's going to happen? There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of ideas. There's a lot of people that think they have it figured out. I am not one of those people. And I don't think as many people that think they have it figured out should. And really where this comes down to, it's not just kind of me being facetious, but I think we need to have a broader idea of the context of sort of where we're sitting now in time and with this issue specifically. This is my favorite meme format when it comes to planning issues. I think it is so applicable to so many of the challenges that we face in the profession where, we're kind of starting off this whole topic with someone getting a sniffle in Wuhan. Pretty shortly after that, all of a sudden we've all downloaded Zoom. Jacob's bought better disinfectant and come up with new plans he's never come up with before. And then, maybe a few weeks from now, this is where we're going to be. And at this point, we're kind of looking forward, and I'm supposed to extrapolate from here sort of what the future of the workplace is without really even considering or necessarily being aware of all of the big dominoes that have yet to fall that we don't even really know where they are yet. And that's really where the transformation of the workplace, I think, is going to be written. It's not so much about how do we make pandemic proof office spaces or how do we ensure that we're ready for the next specific kind of events, not to take away from what Jacob said, but kind of the broader question of how this affects, our workplaces, the workforce, the economy, how it's structured spatially between communities, between regions around the globe. That's going to come from all of the fallout that we really can't predict. And it's very humbling, I think, to look at some of the articles that usually historians are very good at kind of connecting these dots over the long arc of history of, how the Black Death kind of led to the Renaissance 100 years later, how the Spanish flu pandemic 100 years ago kind of has a lot of direct connections to the Roaring 20s and the Great Depression. And those are the kinds of things that really create the social transformations that a topic of how does the workplace after a pandemic evolve, that's really kind of the scale of the issue. So I don't think I have all the answers, but maybe we can guess at them. And to sort of start framing my thinking, I tried to at least start from a position of understanding where we're at now. So if we just look at as of December 2020, which is sort of the most recent year, we have GDP data for. This is all of Canada, comparing basically across the high level aggregations of economic sectors, where employment and productivity or output GDP basically is in comparison to where it was in February of 2020. So there's a few real standout sectors here: transportation, warehousing, accommodations, food services, cultural industries, where really you can see that they bore the brunt of the disruption that was wrought by the pandemic. They had the hardest time adapting to the new normal that we've all had to live with for a year now. So I imagine, that is somewhat indicative of the ability or the capacity for those types of activities to adapt, in terms of how services are delivered or the types of workplaces those activities are taken in. Um, they're unlikely to adapt to the risk, but maybe they'll adapt to changes in customer behavior that comes out of as sort of like a second order effect of the pandemic. Then in the green, we have largely goods producing industries that have adapted to the pandemic mostly just through implementing different work procedures in the existing facilities that they had. So it's either risk management or the nature of those industries are such that things like social distancing really weren't an issue to work with. I've worked on a couple factory floors myself, and it's not sort of the Dickensian, at least in North America, the Dickensian sort of sweatshop at high intensity, density of employee environment. It's a lot of automated, a lot of space between workstations, really not hard to adapt to the epidemiological requirements. So my thought is those are probably unlikely to change fundamentally as a result of the pandemic. And to the extent that they do change going forward, it'll likely be a continuation of the trends that were already in place before the pandemic hit us. Although the pandemic might accelerate that a little bit, or sort of, it's a big kick of the can down the road. And then there's the yellow industries, which are largely sort of the white collar, usually office-based employment, knowledge and service-based economy that characterizes most of developed nations these days. And really, they've adapted predominantly through remote working. Work from home, work from your new home, far from the city or far from the province you used to work in, those types of ideas. And really, this has all just been through mass adoption of largely existing telecom technology and infrastructure and capacity, and to a certain extent, a very quick ramp up in that capacity. But it was all largely in place. And so there's going to be a variety here going forward, I think. Certainly for some industries, the remote work side of things was just kind of a bridge to get through this period, and probably didn't work well enough to be largely implemented. Maybe Jake would have more insight, but education probably is one where it's very hard to replace that in-person student-teacher interaction. So the remote learning is maybe a supplement in certain ways, but not the predominant way going forward. Whereas others, it's probably been largely beneficial, and we would expect to see more significant changes going forward. For many of these industries, I think it's somewhat neutral, and there was a bit of a chicken egg issue in terms of adopting some of the remote work systems and practices. If customers weren't demanding it and everyone else you worked with wasn't really on the same platform, it didn't make sense for you as an organization to kind of go there. I would put our own firm in that position. We had access to remote conferencing software that almost no one used because no one else really was on the same wavelength. So now everyone is, and it's common practice. So kind of looking at the entire economy in broken down into those three very broad categories, what are my guesses for how things are going to go? And again, to reiterate, these are my guesses. And I don't think, as much as there are much smarter people than me that are arguing kind of on either side of a lot of these questions, I don't think anyone's really got it figured out, and we probably won't really realize what's happened until after it already has. So the first one is, I think many workplaces probably aren't going to change all that much. Once we're sort of through the immediate issue of the pandemic itself and kind of adapting to those public health requirements, many industries can probably go back to the way things were. Largely goods producing sectors, you need to be, have a physical location to physically produce physical outputs. And that's not to say things weren't changing, but they were changing, they'll change the same way that they were changing before. And also experiential service sectors. So parts of the service industry where the personal interaction is really part of the service or part of the product that's being offered. So it's hard to imagine how we're going to be able to replace, a hospitality type industry or, sit down restaurant experience with some kind of remote enabled or digitized alternative, or similarly in a manufacturing floor. Automation has already been underway for decades at this point, and it'll probably continue apace. Probably not going to alter that trend very much, specifically because of COVID. Some other workplaces will probably disappear entirely. The other side of the service sector where that human interaction is not critical, is not key, or is not part of the product are very high candidates for automation and digitization. And again, some of those trends have already been underway for some time, but in a lot of ways, the pandemic has kind of accelerated that or solved, as I mentioned before, the sort of chicken egg issue of, okay, now all of us are having to agree to make that transition at once. Whereas before, everyone was kind of holding back because you weren't really sure who was going to be the first to kick off the wave. Interestingly, I think essential services, a lot of the sort of low paid retail and service sector workers that through the real height of the pandemic were highlighted as being, sort of this illustration of the disconnects in our economy between how important a job is to our collective well-being versus the wage that they were earning. They're probably also at a higher risk of disappearing as well. They're essential services, but they're not necessarily essential jobs for humans to do. And that could be done as a response to as a sort of risk management strategy. If these are so essential, let's take out the human risk element. And also, it could be a more of a socio-political kind of consequence. There is no doubt that those sectors now have larger political power, are demanding, better remuneration, or, compensation for the risks that they take on, and it's much more politically aware now. How important they were. And any time that you have sort of the cost of labor going up, whether it's because you're a heartless capitalist or because it's just a business decision, you start to run into that tipping point of where does the cost of humans outweigh the cost of automation. So we might see a lot of those essential services become increasingly automated. Other elements of the same services that I talked about earlier on the workplaces that might not change. So, restaurants, sit-down restaurants, for example, is more insulated. But if I want to get fast food, for example, the human interaction of going and picking up a Big Mac isn't really why I go to McDonald's. In fact, some places it's kind of the least convenient part of it. And so those types of workplaces are also ripe for digitization and automation. Order on your smartphone. A lot of these the prototypes have now been tested out over the last year. We'll probably have smaller fast food restaurants with less sit down area, but maybe more drive-throughs, more sidewalk pickup windows for online orders, that type of thing. And certainly services associated with business travel, I think it's fairly safe to say that now the bar for when it's worth getting on a plane to fly for a meeting is a lot higher because everyone's on Zoom. And so the whole quantity of business travel is likely to remain low and maybe structurally low forever going forward. So now, is it for the hospitality sectors that serve business travel, some of the efficiencies maybe come from having fewer frontline staff to tend to those travelers' needs. So in short, a lot of workplaces kind of being replaced with whatever their contextual equivalent of sort of the self-checkout is. And then for many of the other workplaces, it's going to evolve. And this is where I'll bring it back to sort of that main question in my world of the office worker and the future of the office. I think fully remote workforces will probably still not be the majority going forward. We were seeing fully remote workforces in some white collar service sectors, things like call centers that moved from high cost jurisdictions to lower cost jurisdictions like New Brunswick in the 90s, but still in a physical high density office space, had already in many cases moved to a complete work from home model because the technology allowed it and the incentives were already there. For most industries in terms of like knowledge and professional services, though, I think the remote working abilities and the work from home flexibility is really just going to be part of kind of the overall compensation package going forward. So different people have different opinions or place different values on that flexibility, and it'll just be kind of one of the perks that are offered. in terms of being competitive with your competition for attracting talent. At the end of the day, though, I really think in-office work is still going to remain the majority mode for a lot of those industries. And it comes down to the fact that work from home or a distributed, decentralized workforce, I don't get the sense that the technology has really overcome the fundamental challenges of managing and improving productivity and monitoring teams in that environment, building company culture, building innovation and inventive thinking and that sort of approach to problem solving. You know, I think anyone that's been on Zoom or probably already several times in this conference, there's a kind of fundamental barrier to fluid collaboration on these virtual platforms. You know, who can get their screen shared properly, people talking on mute, you know, a lot of the body language that kind of governs smooth communications doesn't come through on a webcam. And other things, even though I think sort of the younger generation of workers place a lot more value on work from home, there's also some fundamental things you give up in terms of sort of informal opportunities to learn from your more experienced colleagues, or to have more official sort of mentorship relationships with older, more experienced workers, and frankly, just opportunity to find your own niches and kind of guide your way. I was talking a couple weeks ago with a colleague in the industry who's also a former planner. He works for a large commercial landlord, and he was making the point that some of the most interesting work and frankly the career trajectory that he was on at that time, or over the last couple of years, came from these chance encounters with more senior people in his office, at the, you know, in the elevator, at the coffee machine, to hear what they were working on and to kind of pipe up and put himself out there. Oh, I'd be really interested to work on that. It's really hard to get those types of sort of spontaneous opportunities when your meetings are only scheduled, your FaceTime with your colleagues is only, you know, task driven at specific times, and that casual work environment really doesn't exist. And the last thing that I'll say on this is, I think there's also a real double-edged sword kind of nature to remote work. So we're all very excited, it seems, for the ability to move out of higher priced cities or communities to kind of work from lower cost jurisdictions, to kind of do a bit of an arbitrage play between your big city incomes and your small town housing prices, those sorts of things. But that's just kind of the first step, right? And if that's already happening and it's working for you now, how long before your employer starts to figure out, well, maybe I don't need to pay you as much if you don't have a higher cost of living, or maybe I don't need to hire someone that's in Atlantic Canada to work on Bay Street. Maybe I can hire someone that's working on the other side of the world that doesn't have the same sort of compensation expectation. So in a lot of ways, there's a risk for workers, I would say, that some of this could really enable the same sort of trends we've seen in manufacturing, more the goods producing sectors, where globalization and offshoring of the production functions as a cost competitive strategy comes at the cost of workers that are currently very excited for these technologies. So the final word on sort of that workplace work from home thing is, I think that after a year of working in the virtual distributed workplace, is probably getting a lot older for people than it was when a lot of the opinion polls were done earlier in the spring and summer. And so I think office space use will probably continue, maybe change in terms of its design, but is certainly not dead. And I'll just leave it there, and we'll get into the discussion.
Great, thank you, Neil, and thank you, Jacob, as well. Yeah, that very interesting and very thought-provoking from both of you. I work on a lot of climate change files, so it's my opinion that pandemic is the first step in, you know, some massive societal changes that are happening. So it's interesting to hear both of what you're doing in the immediate term and in the long term, and what you're thinking about for the workplace and for society in general. I hang on, let's see. I don't see any questions yet. So if there is anybody that has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So I'll start with a question, and maybe you guys can answer that. So, you know, from as a planner, and we're talking to school planning, so the planning looks at long-term decisions, or sorry, at the long term, and decisions that are made today affect what happens possibly decades in the future. So specifically land use, but also where things get put. From your professional perspective, how do you think the pandemic is influencing decision making today? So the decisions that are happening today, and what kinds of impacts might there be in the long term because of that? I don't know, Jacob, if you want to start on that one.
Sure. I see right now what I see people doing is giving themselves more wiggle room and not being too afraid to do it. So I think what we saw in education is that we didn't have slack on anything. Everything where we could save, we were. We didn't have a lot of wiggle room to make good decisions when a problem came up. So what I know now and what I see now in the way the decision makers who hold budget in provincial government are thinking about things is they're giving us more rope to say what if, and are you sure, and do you need a bit more? If so, hold it here, let's get through this, and we'll see if we need that in the future. Now I expect that will end someday soon. We know there's belt tightening coming, but what I see now is not waste, it's flexibility and allowing us to handle our costs through forecasts, which I think is necessary. So I don't think it's long-term decisions right now, it's medium term. So our capital plans, we're not building schools bigger than they need to be right now. We've got a school being built for 380 kids in the north end of Halifax, and no one's saying just build it for 500 in case. Because our projections data shows them at 360, 370 kids. And we don't see the growth to Halifax pushing us that high on that one instance. And any individual project in a system our size is almost a drop in the bucket, right? Like, so, 53,000 kids, we build 2 or 3 schools at a time. So we might be addressing space for 2% of our population. Well, the other 98% is in the same buildings that we had last year. And for the 46 years before that, our average age of building is 46 years. Our oldest buildings are 95 years. I've got 3 buildings in the 90s that kids go to school in every day. So, they were probably impacted more by the Spanish flu than by coronavirus.
Neil?
Yeah, I think you framed that really well, Jacob, that it's, like I don't see any long-term decision making and coming out of the pandemic. Frankly, I think it would almost be foolish to, because one of the kind of characteristics of the pandemic is that it's a 1 in 100-year type event. Some discussion around how maybe those timelines get shorter with climate change and those sorts of things. But when you're talking about the built environment, which is really what most of planning is concerned with, there's it's hugely capital intensive to do anything, to build anything structural in buildings, infrastructure, all of that stuff is big money, big amount of society's resources, and it's not something on a whim that we can just kind of adjust because of what the trendy problem everyone's worried about today is. And then the other thing, Jacob, that you also articulated really well is the kind of inertia that's built into that system, right? Most of the stuff in our communities already exists. Most of the schools exist. You build 1 or 2 a year. So we're talking about, it's the same with housing. Most of the housing exists. We build 1 to 2% new housing stock in terms of a percentage increase. And all of this stuff takes a long, long time to kind of filter through into these physical forms. Even just in terms of office space, buildings that already exist, and how would we reconfigure the office space that does exist to kind of reflect some of those changing business needs. Office leases are often 5 or 10 years long. Businesses today that have a certain established business model might not want changes. It'll be the new business that are forming kind of after the pandemic that start to drive some of those things. So it'll take a long, long time to trickle through. And I think it's really something that we don't have the ability, and we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking we have the ability to predict as planners. So I would like to think that maybe the solution is not so much of, okay, what do we need to anticipate and let's put the pieces in place. It's more of a systems design perspective. How does planning work as a system how do we make the planning system more responsive, more nimble, more easily, more, yeah, I guess more responsive to the need to adapt when the unexpected happens. And so we're not kind of caught flat-footed, so that that trickle-down effect can be sped up a little bit more.
I do want to jump on with one thing we did in schools in the last 2 years. Um, we've started working with modular construction where we can add real additions to schools in short time frames, which has allowed us. It's one of these things where we started it before the pandemic came, but it's in planning and construction and anything we're doing, preparing for a public good, we should be preparing for that flexibility. So, 18 months ago, when I embarked on a modular expansion to a school, instead of a regular A&A with an architect, a design, a tender, all of that, we just bought these modular blocks and we put them together, and we have an addition to a school of 8 classrooms that we installed in 6 weeks. We purchased it months in advance, and it came down on trucks from Quebec, and we sanitized it really well because it came down in the middle of the pandemic. But it was for us, that gave us flexibility now, where new school sites like the new JL Ilsley, one of the walls is intended to be the expansion area one day when we need that space. So it's a new high school in the Spryfield area of Halifax. Same with the new SJAM in the north end of Halifax. There's a portion, an area on the site that's being kept clear of significant infrastructure investment. So if and when we do need the space, it's not a question of another new building. We can expand the ones we already have. So we are getting smart about that. We got smart about it before the pandemic. Gives us some wiggle room now. So I say we're not building the schools bigger, but we're not hemming ourselves in, so we're absolutely stuck in the future. And I think that's what both Neil and I are talking about, is that idea that how can planning be more nimble? How can we, because we don't know the future, the only thing I know about my growth projections is that they're wrong, right? Like that's the only, everything else about them is unknown. So I need to be able to be flexible. I can't be stuck to the same building for 95 years, because I might have to be on that site for 95 years.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I just had this flashback to planning theory class. So we used to, planning, the old style planning was that comprehensive. We have it all planned out. If we build it, they will come, and that's exactly what's going to happen. And really what it's more about is that iterative planning and kind of just going with the flow, and and having that nimbleness to planning. I really appreciate that. And I think, again, given our future in not just pandemics, but climate change and the impacts that potentially is going to have on both the economy and society and environment and all those kind of things, that's going to become the way that we plan now, as opposed to having that more comprehensive approach to things. Just in terms of that, though, so there's been some things that have happened in the short term that have gotten people talking. So, and again, there might not be any long-term credence to it, but for instance, the pandemic has facilitated a rapid and somewhat significant boost in immigration to the maritime provinces. Housing is crazy right at the moment in most of the large cities, but it's happening in the small communities as well. In Sackville, for instance, you cannot buy a single family home. You can, but it's really, they're few and far between now. So, and again, these people are coming from generally other parts of the country. So we're experiencing that immigration thing. And maybe it has to do with the Atlantic bubble and the success on the pandemic. Maybe it has to do with being able to work from home now. I don't know, but what kind of impact does this relatively new trend have on planning practices, or is it, again, just a blip, do you think? Neil, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I think, I think we need to step back a little bit and have a bit more context on that trend specifically. So there's a lot going on in housing right now.
Mhm.
And a lot of it is not tied to anything planning has any control over, and frankly, not anything even at a provincial level or at like an immigration policy kind of level you have control over, because it's a lot of kind of macroeconomic stuff, and just how that hits market conditions that are still in a pandemic context. And so I think our hands are tied on it. Like we just got to ride that out, and probably we won't really have to ride that out too much longer. Maybe those are famous last words. But there is a trend, certainly, of people migrating from elsewhere in Canada to Atlantic Canada. I actually think it's probably been less in the last year than it has been in the 2 years prior to. A lot of the conversation around housing, and especially in our region, the migration element, it's driven by, media stories, which the media isn't there to give us a comprehensive sort of data analysis. It's there to kind of tell us the narrative of what's going on and to inform us a little bit of, here's what we think everyone else thinks is happening. And so there's a bit of a maybe perception issue going on where I think it's a lot bigger in the popular mind than it really is on the ground, but it certainly is happening. So it's not to say your question isn't fair or is wrong or anything like that. But yeah, it's something that's been going on for a while. It's largely a product of demographic trends. A lot of the folks moving out this way are coming because it's part of their retirement planning. Either they're from here or they have vacationed here, and there's always kind of this romantic idea to, the kids are out of the nest in Vancouver and Toronto, and we'll downsize and live on the seaside, or try to operate a B&B or something like that as a retirement project. And that's something that's kind of, it's not new. It goes in waves, but it happened in the 70s in Nova Scotia. There was a lot of sales of B&Bs and motels and things like that, to restaurants, to folks from Bay Street, and it's something that I think we're well equipped to, if perhaps not used to, because it hasn't happened very much in the more recent past, although in the last couple of years it's been building up. And fundamentally, I think it's just basic stuff of, we need to make sure that there's enough housing being built for the people that are moving here, and that we're doing a good job of kind of separating out the issues from the narrative and figuring out what are the real things happening on the ground, that we and kind of tailoring our solutions that way.
I think too, Tracy, I got to hear a bit of what the folks on the library call were saying, and what it makes me think of when I hear stories from colleagues in neighborhoods and communities in Nova Scotia who are worried about the narrative and that there won't be housing available that has the amenities we want. Really, what it should drive us to do as planners is build more housing that has amenity available to it, or build more amenity where the housing is. I think what we see in Halifax is our most desirable neighborhoods that have the 10 or 15-minute walk to all assets are under the most pressure, and then it cascades down from there. There's pressure everywhere. But if we had, all of us should drive, everyone on this at this conference, we should be driving to make sure every community, every host we build has some, at least is getting closer to that complete community, so that there's more options for everyone. Those who are moving here from away, or those who are moving into their first home from an apartment, or those who are renting, all of us should have access to not just the library, but all the other amenities that make these places desirable for us, and therefore make them desirable for others. Right? It shouldn't be surprising that the neighborhood you love is attractive to others. Wouldn't it be great though if there were more of them? And that should be hopefully what we're all working on as planners, is making more of those neighborhoods, so that we're not guarding some precious resource that other people can't come and have because this is our only good neighborhood, or it's the only town that is nice to live in. So I think all of us work to make as many neighborhoods and communities great, so that it's not a rarity. It's not something we fight over. It's something that it's in abundance rather than a scarcity.
Great, thank you. Just a reminder to anyone that's listening, feel free to add some questions in chat. I don't see any there yet. I got one more question. So API, as I said, I'm on the board there. We conducted a survey of members in January. Really, it was kind of a pandemic. How are you faring through the pandemic, and also just in terms of member services? We found that, like many other professions, planners are experiencing a lot of burnout and stress as a result of the combined personal stress. You were alluding to that, Jacob, from the pandemic, the homework balance, the kids being at home, that kind of thing, as well as, there's been a lot of, I don't know if people just don't, maybe the, again, the increase in stress for people in planning offices is that people haven't been spending their money on travel, so they've been spending it on development, whether it's just garages or whether it's other things that they've been doing. But most of the planners that I talk to, especially the ones that work in the municipalities, are running on, just fumes at this point. Are any words of advice for both seasoned or new planners for, kind of, I don't know, just what you say to people who are experiencing this?
Who wants to go
Neil
first?
also has young children.
Maybe,
I
sorry, you
think
go ahead.
the thing that, or sorry, Neil, just, I mean, I talked to my colleagues about this. I think we have to be open about mental health. I think it's like, it's very common, especially in leadership, to not want to show the weakness, or admit that it's hard. And I think, what I've seen through the pandemic is people are a little more willing to do that. And I speak, obviously from a position of privilege where, I don't get, I'm a white, straight man in Nova Scotia. It's, it's easy for me to say that, but I don't have the same vulnerabilities or risks that others may face. But I do think it's important. Recognize the network that supports you, whether it's your family, friends, parts of your work that are energizing versus parts of your work that are draining. I have never worked in the permits part of a planning department because I would find it too draining. But if others, if there's parts of that that are energizing and parts of that that are really draining, you got to balance those. And be intentional about it. Be open about it with your boss. Make sure people understand what you're doing and why, so that you can stay engaged with the work. I mean, our work is we're all planners because of that value we see in building these communities, right? And seeing something built that wouldn't have been there had we not been in the role doing our part. So, I think you got to find those, be intentional about identifying them and celebrating them. And if you're not getting it from your coworkers, give it to them and see if they can then give it back to you. Neil?
Yeah, I think I don't know. I don't have any training on mental health
No.
counseling, so I can just maybe speak to my own perspective. And yeah, it's we're definitely feeling the pressure, the busyness. A lot of people kind of assume, oh, there's a lot of development going on, ergo I, a planning consultant, am very busy. I don't actually do a lot of development work, but I do a lot of work with municipalities, and most recently a lot of affordable housing related projects, which unfortunately is big business these days. And so, yeah, we've certainly felt that around our office for the last year. Like that chart I showed of the GDP and employment relative to February, you'll notice that real estate, which is the world I live in, is the only one where both of those bars are above their February threshold. Um, I'm used to high stress. Not that, we have a pretty good work environment here, but it's the nature of consulting is there are crunch periods due to deadlines and how projects line up. And for me, it's always been more of a physical kind of thing where, it might affect how well I'm sleeping that week, or in extreme cases, maybe I need some antihistamines because I break out in stress hives once every 5 years or something like that. And that's kind of been, even through my my education, it's something I've kind of learned how to manage and deal with. And usually it just is an issue of kind of gritting your teeth and getting through it because it's only a couple weeks long. So that's been going on. But what I've found, and really it's been more recently, that it's more of like the emotional mental health side of the stress, which is something I'm not as equipped and not as used to dealing with. And my gut reaction, I think, from my kind of physical stress management strategies, and probably just the way I was raised and the outlook that my parents have, is always to try to kind of look on the bright side. Things, other people have it worse. Kind of be thankful for what you have. And so that was sort of how I had been tackling that. And I really found that it wasn't working very well. I'm still gainfully employed. My wife is still gainfully employed. We have a single child, which is manageable, but still work. She's in the school system, but not very old, so that she's kind of not really aware of a lot of the challenges going on. So it's all very manageable. It doesn't, you don't have to look too far to see people that have it a lot worse. And that my reaction is to kind of hold on to that and to kind of minimize, I guess, the feelings that I'm feeling. And it wasn't until I was kind of talking through that with a colleague of mine as we were driving up for a project kickoff meeting, and she just kind of said, yeah, that perspective's kind of bullshit, right? Like, that's actually a very harmful way to not give yourself permission to sort of feel what you're feeling, to acknowledge that. And honestly, like, yeah, in the last couple months, it's been something that's really changed my thinking, and I think has, like, really helped me deal with more of the mental stress that I wasn't used to dealing with. Just kind of giving myself permission to acknowledge that there are things I'm experiencing that are difficult, that, yeah, other people have it worse, but I'm in a incredibly privileged place, but I still have issues too that I need to kind of acknowledge and at least begin to work through and kind of see as legitimate myself. So that's about as far as I've gotten with it, but even that alone, I think, was a big help.
Yeah. No, I thank you both for that. I think it is something we need to acknowledge. I know for me, I always really enjoyed the conferences. So this is interesting because it is a conference, but it's you don't have the opportunity to just chit chat with people in during the breaks and go, oh my God, you wouldn't believe what I've had to deal with. Because a lot of the times, especially if it's work related stress, there aren't many people that get what we do in terms of why it's stressful, and what it can be like working with the public or working with certain populations, or people's property, and how personally they take it. So I always really like the conferences. So that's the one really unfortunate thing that's happening. You simply can't do that on a Zoom conference. You really do need some of that face-to-face time. So hopefully once we've all been inoculated and we can get together again, we can have some of those times where we can mutually support one another. I know API is attempting to put together some sessions again, that will kind of help lead us to that, but again, it's just not quite the same. I think that's it for us. I guess I turn it over to Travis then. Thank you both, Jacob and Neil.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thanks, Neil.
Yes, thank you again very much, everyone. That was audience was a little quiet with questions, but I know my mind was kind of churning the whole time. So I had questions, but they weren't in a form that I could put them into words during the session. Lots to chew on. So now we're going to move into our next session here coming up. If you are a student, I would highly recommend staying on right now. We're going to move on to learning how to be a professional planner. This is another session. API is hosting this one again, as Tracy has hosted this last session for us. So we'll be moving into the session with Crystal Fuller and Nzinga